The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped beneath the apartment door while Emma Chen was in the shower. She found it when she stepped out, the paper already damp from the steam that had seeped through the bathroom door. The words were formal, impersonal, printed in a font that suggested efficiency rather than sympathy. 30 days to vacate. Past due balance itemized in a column that made her stomach tighten. She read it twice, standing in her bathrobe, water still dripping from her hair onto the cheap linoleum floor that had never quite dried properly, no matter how many times she mopped it. Her daughter's voice carried from the bedroom, a sing-song rhythm that suggested she was talking to her stuffed animals rather than getting ready for school. Emma folded the notice carefully and placed it on the kitchen counter beside the stack of other papers she had been avoiding. Medical bills from Lily's emergency room visit 3 months earlier. Credit card statements she no longer opened. A reminder from the electric company about payment arrangements. The papers had become a fixture in the apartment, a small monument to everything she could not fix. She made breakfast mechanically, toast and scrambled eggs, the routine so practiced that her hands moved without thought. Lily appeared in the doorway wearing mismatched socks and a shirt that was slightly too small, the hem riding up to expose a strip of pale stomach. She was 7 years old and still believed that her mother could solve any problem if she tried hard enough. Emma set the plate on the table and watched her daughter eat. Each bite a small reminder of what would be lost if she could not find a way forward. The job at the medical supply warehouse paid $12 an hour, 40 hours a week, when they could give them to her. It wasn't enough. It had never been enough. But it was what she had, and she guarded those hours the way other people guarded savings accounts or retirement plans. The divorce had taken everything else. The house, the shared bank account, the future she had imagined building with someone who turned out to be building a different future entirely. What remained was this apartment, her daughter, and a growing collection of debts that compounded faster than she could address them. The phone call came while she was at work, her hands occupied with inventory sheets and the monotonous task of scanning barcodes. Her sister's name appeared on the screen. Emma almost let it go to voicemail. Conversations with Claire had become predictable over the past year, a careful dance around the obvious disparities in their lives. Claire had married well, lived in a house with a finished basement and a yard that required professional landscaping. Her children attended private school. Her concerns were different. But something made Emma answer. She stepped into the break room, the fluorescent lights casting everything in a flat, colorless glow. "Grandfather died," Claire said without preamble. Her voice carried the tone of someone delivering information rather than grief. "Last night. Heart failure. The funeral is Friday." Emma leaned against the wall, the cool concrete pressing through her thin work shirt. Their grandfather had been 93 years old, a man who had outlived his wife by 2 decades and most of his friends by longer. She had visited him sporadically over the years, more out of obligation than connection. He had been kind in a distant way, offering her tea in china cups that trembled slightly in his aged hands, asking questions about her life that required only brief answers. "There's a will," Claire continued. "We need to be there for the reading. Saturday morning at the lawyer's office." The words settled with a weight Emma recognized immediately. Her sister's tone had shifted, becoming careful in the way it did when discussing money. The subtext was clear. There would be an estate. Things would be divided. Emma's financial situation was not a secret, and neither was the judgment that accompanied it. Poor decisions. Claire had said once during an argument Emma had tried to forget. "You made poor decisions, and now you have to live with them." "I'll be there," Emma said quietly. The funeral was held in a church Emma did not remember visiting, though Claire insisted they had attended services there as children. The building was old, its pews worn smooth by generations of congregants, the air inside cool and faintly musty. A handful of elderly acquaintances filled the first few rows, people who remembered her grandfather from lodge meetings or community events that no longer existed. Emma sat beside Claire, their mother between them, a woman whose grief expressed itself through rigid posture and a refusal to cry. The service was brief. A pastor who had met her grandfather only recently spoke about faith and perseverance. Emma listened without absorbing the words, her mind already moving ahead to Saturday, to the lawyer's office, to whatever small inheritance might ease the pressure that had been building for months. It was not hope, exactly, more like a tentative calculation. Even a few $1,000s could buy time. Time to catch up on rent, to negotiate with creditors, to breathe. Saturday arrived with rain that started before dawn and showed no sign of stopping. Emma dropped Lily at a friend's house, promising to return before dinner, then drove to the address Claire had texted her. The lawyer's office occupied the second floor of a building that looked older than her grandfather had been, its brick facade stained by decades of weather. Inside, the air smelled of paper and old wood. A receptionist gestured them toward a conference room where Claire was already seated, her posture perfect, her handbag resting on the floor beside her chair. Their mother arrived moments later, followed by an uncle Emma barely knew and a cousin whose name she had forgotten. The lawyer entered last, a man in his 60s with reading glasses perched on his nose and a folder thick enough to suggest complications. He greeted them with the formal courtesy of someone who had performed this ritual many times before, then sat at the head of the table and opened the folder. The reading began with standard language, legal phrases that meant little to Emma. The distribution of assets followed a logic she had expected. The house, a modest 2-bedroom in a neighborhood that had seen better days, went to their mother. Bank accounts, modest but carefully maintained, were divided equally among the children. Claire received a collection of first-edition books, their value noted in careful appraisal language. The uncle received tools and workshop equipment. The cousin received a car that still ran despite its age. Emma listened, waiting for her name, feeling the small flame of hope begin to flicker. When the lawyer finally mentioned her, his tone shifted slightly, becoming almost apologetic. To Emma Chen, I leave my antique armoire, purchased in France in 1952, and all its contents. The room was quiet. Emma stared at the lawyer, waiting for him to continue, to add something that would make sense of the bequest. But he simply turned the page and moved on to minor bequests, charitable donations, and the closing instructions. Claire's voice cut through the silence. The armoire, that ugly thing in his bedroom. The lawyer nodded. The same. Emma felt heat rise in her face, a flush of humiliation that started at her chest and spread upward. She had seen the armoire countless times during visits to her grandfather's house. It was massive, dark, and outdated, its wood finish scratched and dull. It took up most of one wall in his bedroom, a relic from another era that did not fit with anything else in the modest home. She had never thought of it as valuable. No one had. That's it. The words came out before she could stop them. The lawyer met her eyes with something that might have been sympathy. Your grandfather was very specific about his wishes. Claire let out a short laugh, quickly stifled. Their mother's expression remained neutral, but Emma saw the flicker of something else beneath it. Pity. Perhaps. Or confirmation of a narrative that had been building for years. Emma, who made poor decisions. Emma, who could not manage her life. Emma, who inherited furniture while others inherited value. The meeting concluded with paperwork and signatures. Emma moved through the motions automatically, her mind already calculating the logistics of removing a massive piece of furniture from her grandfather's house, and finding somewhere to put it. Her apartment barely had room for what she already owned. Storage units cost money she did not have. Selling it would require finding someone willing to buy outdated furniture in questionable condition. As they left the building, Claire caught up with her in the parking lot. Rain fell steadily, drumming against the asphalt and turning the gutters into small rivers. "You could just leave it," Claire said, not unkindly. "Mom's selling the house anyway. They'll clear everything out." Emma pulled her jacket tighter, feeling the rain soak through the thin fabric. "He left it to me." "It's a piece of furniture, Emma. A very large, very impractical piece of furniture." Claire hesitated, then added, "You don't have to take everything he gives you just because he gave it." The implication hung between them. Her grandfather's bequest had been a burden, not a gift. Another problem to solve when Emma already had too many. She should walk away from it the way practical people walked away from complications that offered no clear benefit. "I'll figure it out," Emma said. She drove to her grandfather's house alone, arriving as the rain began to ease into a gray drizzle. The neighborhood was quiet. The kind of place where lawns were maintained and neighbors waved from porches. Her grandfather's house stood at the end of a cul-de-sac, small and unassuming, with a detached garage and a garden that had been carefully tended until recently. Inside, the air was still and cool. The furniture sat exactly as it had during her last visit, covered now with thin sheets of dust. Emma moved through the room slowly, touching surfaces that had shaped her grandfather's daily life. The kitchen where he had made her tea, the living room where he had sat in a worn armchair reading newspapers, the bedroom where the armoire stood. It was even larger than she remembered. The piece dominated the space, rising nearly to the ceiling, its dark wood absorbing light rather than reflecting it. The doors were carved with elaborate designs that had once been elegant, but now seemed heavy and oppressive. Brass handles, tarnished to a dull green, hung at odd angles. One door sat slightly ajar, revealing shelves lined with yellowed paper. Emma opened both doors fully. Inside, the armoire was divided into compartments. The upper section held shelves stacked with linens, old blankets, and what appeared to be her grandmother's clothing, preserved but faded. The lower section contained drawers, their contents a jumble of photographs, letters, and small personal items that no one had organized or discarded. Everything smelled of mothballs and age. She stood there for a long time, trying to understand why her grandfather had chosen this, why this piece of furniture, this burden, had been designated specifically for her. There was no note, no explanation tucked among the linens, just the armoire itself, stolid and immovable. Over the next week, Emma returned to the house between work shifts to sort through the armoire's contents. She worked methodically, removing each item, deciding what to keep and what to discard. Most of it was worthless. Old sheets that had been mended so many times they could no longer be called functional. Sweaters eaten through by moths. Photographs of people she did not recognize, their names lost to time. She mentioned the inheritance to a co-worker during lunch, a woman named Patricia, who had worked at the warehouse longer than anyone else and whose advice Emma had learned to trust. An armoire? Patricia's eyebrows rose. Like a wardrobe? A very large, very old wardrobe, Emma confirmed. French, apparently. From the 50s. Could be worth something. Antiques are weird that way. Emma shook her head. It's in terrible condition. Scratched, stained, missing hardware. I looked up similar pieces online. Even in good shape, they don't sell for much. This one would be lucky to get $100. So why take it? The question had been circling in Emma's mind since the reading of the will. Because he left it to me, and I don't know why. Patricia nodded slowly, understanding something Emma had not fully articulated. Sometimes things have value that doesn't show up in listings. That evening, Emma hired 2 men with a truck to transport the armoire to her apartment. The cost of the move ate into her grocery budget for the week, but she had committed to the decision and could not reverse it now. The men struggled with the weight, their faces red with effort as they maneuvered the piece down the narrow staircase and out the front door. In her apartment, they placed it against the only wall large enough to accommodate it, blocking the window in Lily's bedroom. Her daughter stared at it with wide eyes. "What is that?" "It was your great-grandfather's," Emma said. "Now it's ours." "It's ugly." Emma could not argue. The armoire looked even worse in the small bedroom, its bulk overwhelming the space. It cast shadows that made the room feel darker, smaller, more confined. She had made a mistake bringing it here. Claire had been right. This was a burden, not a gift. But it was done now. The armoire stood in her apartment, a monument to decisions she did not fully understand. Over the following days, neighbors noticed. Mrs. Roland Patel from downstairs mentioned it when they passed in the hallway, her tone carefully neutral. "Moving furniture." "It was an inheritance," Emma explained. "Ah." Mrs. Patel's expression shifted slightly, sympathy mixing with something else. "These old things, they take up so much space." The superintendent stopped by later that week, ostensibly to check the water heater, but his eyes moved immediately to the armoire visible through Lily's open bedroom door. "That's a big piece," he said. "It was my grandfather's." He nodded slowly. "You know, if you need to store it somewhere else, there's a storage facility on Route 9. Monthly rates aren't too bad." The suggestion was clear. The armoire did not belong here. It was too large, too old, too out of place. It marked her as someone who made impractical choices, someone who accepted burdens she should have refused. Emma thanked him without committing to anything. After he left, she stood in Lily's bedroom and stared at the armoire. In daylight, she could see details she had missed before. The carving on the doors was more intricate than it had appeared, vines and flowers intertwining in patterns that suggested skill. The wood, beneath the dust and scratches, had a depth of color that spoke to quality. This had been a fine piece once. Someone had valued it enough to bring it across an ocean. She ran her fingers along the doorframe, feeling the grain of the wood. The brass handles, though tarnished, were heavy and solid. Real brass, not plated. She pulled open the drawer she had not fully explored before, finding more letters, more photographs, a jewelry box containing costume pieces that had no value. At the back of the bottom drawer, her fingers touched something unexpected, a resistance where there should have been wood. She pulled the drawer out completely, setting it on the floor, and leaned closer to examine the interior cavity. The back panel of the drawer space sat slightly forward from where it should have been. The difference was minimal, perhaps half an inch, but enough to create a gap that did not match the armoire's exterior dimensions. Emma pressed against the panel. It did not move. She tried sliding it sideways. Nothing. She felt along the edges, searching for a mechanism, a release, anything that might explain the discrepancy. Her fingers found a small indentation on the right side, hidden beneath a lip of wood that formed the drawer's track. She pressed it. Something inside clicked softly, a sound so quiet she almost missed it. The back panel shifted, moving inward by a fraction. Emma's heart rate quickened. She pulled the panel carefully, feeling it slide along grooves she could not see. It moved smoothly, deliberately, revealing a space behind it that had been completely hidden. The cavity was not large, perhaps 8 inches deep, but it extended the full width of the armoire's base. Inside, there were packages. They were wrapped carefully in oilcloth, sealed with wax that had cracked and yellowed with age. Emma reached for the nearest one, her hands trembling slightly. The cloth was stiff but intact. She carried it to the living room where the light was better and set it on the coffee table. Lily appeared in the doorway, curious. "What's that?" "I don't know yet." Emma unwrapped the cloth slowly, careful not to tear it. Inside was another layer of protection, this time thin paper that crinkled at her touch. When she finally revealed the contents, she stared for several seconds without speaking. Papers. Documents, specifically. But not the kind she had found scattered throughout the armoire's drawers. These were formal, printed on heavy stock, bearing seals and signatures that suggested official importance. She picked up the first one carefully, squinting at the small print. It was a bearer bond, issued in 1951 by the United States Treasury. The denomination was listed clearly at the bottom. $10,000. Emma set it down and picked up the next document. Another bond. Same year, same denomination. She began sorting through the package systematically, her movements becoming faster as the reality of what she was seeing began to penetrate. 15 bonds in the first package, all bearer bonds, all from the same year, all in denominations of $10,000. She returned to the armoire and retrieved the second package. Her hands were shaking now, making it difficult to unwrap the oilcloth. Inside, she found more bonds. 20 this time, denominated at $5,000 each. The third package contained stock certificates, their elaborate borders and formal language marking them as genuine even to her untrained eye. Companies she recognized, companies that still existed, their names printed in bold letters across the top of each certificate. The fourth package was smaller. When she unwrapped it, she found jewelry. Not costume pieces like those in the drawer above, but serious jewelry. A necklace with stones that caught the light even in the dim room. Earrings that matched. A bracelet with a clasp that looked like it required a jeweler's hands to open properly. Each piece was wrapped individually in tissue paper that had aged to a pale yellow. Emma sat on the floor, surrounded by opened packages, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. This was not supposed to be here. Bearer bonds did not hide in armoires. Stock certificates did not get stored behind secret panels. Jewelry like this did not sit forgotten in furniture inherited by granddaughters who could barely pay rent. Lily knelt beside her, picking up one of the bonds with the careful reverence children reserve for things that seem important to adults. "Is this money?" Emma took the bond from her gently. "I think so." "I'm not sure yet." She continued searching the hidden compartment, removing each package methodically. There were 10 in total. By the time she finished, the coffee table was covered with documents, jewelry, and several small velvet bags that contained what she initially thought were glass beads, but upon closer inspection, appeared to be something else entirely. The diamonds were loose, unset, varying in size from small chips to stones nearly a centimeter across. They lay in the velvet bags like captured light, their facets catching even the weak illumination from the overhead bulb. Emma held one up, watching it refract the light into fragments of color. She had never held a diamond before. She did not know how to assess quality or determine value, but she knew instinctively that these were real. She took photographs of everything with her phone, the images blurry at first because her hands would not steady. Then she carefully returned each item to its package, wrapping them back in the oilcloth and placed them in the hidden compartment. She slid the panel back into place, listening for the click that indicated it had locked. The armoire returned to its appearance of solid, unremarkable furniture. Emma did not sleep that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind cycling through possibilities and implications. The bonds alone represented hundreds of thousands of dollars. The stock certificates, depending on when they had been issued and how the companies had performed over the decades, could be worth even more. The jewelry and diamonds were unknown quantities, but their presence suggested value on a scale she could not begin to estimate. Why had her grandfather kept these things? Why hidden? Why not in a bank, in a safe deposit box, in any of the secure locations people used for assets this significant? And why had he left them to her, wrapped in silence, without explanation or instruction? The questions multiplied faster than answers formed, but beneath them all was a single, inescapable truth. The thing everyone had dismissed as worthless, the burden she had been mocked for accepting, contained wealth that could change her life entirely. If it was real, if it was legal, if she could claim it without losing it to taxes, creditors, or complications she did not yet understand. As dawn broke, Emma made a decision. She would tell no one yet. Not Claire, not her mother, not even Patricia. She would research quietly, carefully, moving through official channels to verify what she had found before revealing it to anyone who might take it from her. The armoire stood against the wall in Lily's bedroom, its dark wood absorbing the morning light. From the outside, it remained exactly what it had appeared to be, an old, heavy, impractical piece of furniture that had been passed down to the family member least equipped to deal with it. But Emma knew better now. She knew what waited behind the hidden panel, and she understood, with a clarity that made her hands tremble, that her grandfather's final gift had not been the armoire itself. It had been everything the armoire concealed. The first step was verification. Emma could not move forward with the bonds, the certificates, or the jewelry until she understood what she actually possessed. The internet provided basic information, but it was vague and often contradictory. Bearer bonds issued before a certain date might still be redeemable, or they might have expired. Stock certificates from defunct companies were worthless unless the companies had merged or been acquired, in which case their value might have transferred. Every search led to more questions. She needed expertise, but expertise meant exposure. The moment she walked into a bank or consulted a financial advisor, she would be creating a record. People would ask how she came to possess these assets. They would want documentation, provenance, proof of legitimate ownership. Emma had only the will, which mentioned an armoire and its contents, but provided no inventory, no appraisal, no specific accounting of what those contents included. The eviction notice had been extended, not withdrawn. Her landlord had agreed to an additional 2 weeks after Emma promised partial payment. But the pressure remained constant. Bills continued to arrive. Lily needed new shoes. The car made a sound that suggested expensive repairs were imminent. The knowledge of the hidden wealth pressed against her daily reality like 2 photographs that refused to align. She began with the stock certificates, reasoning that they were the most straightforward to investigate. She chose one at random, a company whose name she recognized, and searched for information about its history. The company still existed, though it had undergone several mergers and name changes over the decades. The certificate in her possession predated all of them. Whether it retained any claim on current shares was unclear. Emma called the company's investor relations department, keeping her questions hypothetical. If someone possessed an old certificate, what would be the process for determining its value? The representative was polite but vague. They would need to see the certificate. Authentication would be required. There would be fees. The timeline could extend to several months. She tried the same approach with 2 other companies. The answers varied, but the underlying message was consistent. Verification would be slow, bureaucratic, and expensive. And there was no guarantee of outcome. The bearer bonds presented different complications. Emma learned that the government had stopped issuing them decades earlier. Specifically, because they were difficult to track and easy to use for illegal purposes. Redeeming them now required proof that they had been obtained legally. The burden of that proof fell on the holder. Her grandfather had owned these bonds for over 70 years. Whatever documentation might have existed when he purchased them was long gone. There were no receipts, no purchase agreements, no bank records that Emma could access. Just the bonds themselves, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden behind a panel. The jewelry was perhaps the most straightforward. Jewelry could be appraised without extensive documentation. Its value was inherent in the materials and craftsmanship. But taking it to a jeweler meant revealing its existence, and jewelers were required by law to report certain transactions. If the pieces turned out to be stolen, if they had been reported missing at any point in the past 70 years, Emma could lose everything and face questions she could not answer. She sat at her kitchen table late one night, surrounded by notes and printouts from her research, feeling the weight of impossible choices. Every path forward carried risk, but standing still meant watching the wealth slip away, remaining forever hidden while her life continued to collapse around it. A memory surfaced, unbidden. Her grandfather's hands, trembling slightly as he poured tea into china cups. The care he took with small objects, the way he wrapped gifts precisely, folding corners with attention that seemed excessive for the occasion. She had interpreted it as the fastidiousness of age. Now she wondered if it had been something else. The habits of a man who had spent decades protecting secrets. Emma pulled one of the photographs from the hidden compartment, a black and white image of her grandfather as a young man, standing beside a woman she assumed was her grandmother. They were in front of a building she did not recognize, dressed formally, their expressions serious. On the back, written in faded ink, was a date: Paris, 1952. The Armoire had been purchased in France in 1952, the same year as the photograph, the same year the bonds had been issued. It was not coincidence. Her grandfather had left his home country with his young wife, carrying with him assets he could not or would not leave behind. He had concealed them in furniture designed for the purpose, then transported them across an ocean to a new life in a country that asked fewer questions. Emma understood then that the wealth hidden in the armoire was not simply a windfall. It was the preserved residue of a life her grandfather had left behind. Whether that life had been dangerous, political, or simply practical was impossible to determine now. But he had chosen to hide these assets rather than legitimize them, to pass them on through silence rather than explanation. The question facing Emma was whether to honor that silence or break it. The decision was made for her by necessity. The extended deadline from her landlord arrived and passed. She paid what she could, drawing from the small savings account she had promised herself not to touch. It was not enough. The landlord's response was polite but firm. An official eviction process would begin if full payment was not received within 7 days. Emma looked at the armoire standing in her daughter's bedroom and made her choice. She would not lose her home because she was too afraid to claim what had been given to her. Whatever complications lay ahead, whatever risks she was taking, the alternative was worse. She started with the jewelry. It felt like the safest entry point, the least likely to trigger investigations or legal entanglements. She chose a single piece, the necklace with the clear stones that she hoped were diamonds. She wrapped it carefully and placed it in her purse. The jeweler she selected was in a different neighborhood, chosen because he had been in business for decades, and his advertisements emphasized discretion. The shop was small, its windows displaying estate pieces and vintage designs. Inside, the lighting was warm, and the air smelled faintly of metal polish. The jeweler was older than Emma had expected, his hand steady as he examined the necklace under a loupe. He did not speak while he worked, his expression neutral. Emma waited, her heart beating hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. Finally, he set the loop down and looked at her. "Where did you get this?" "It was my grandmother's." The lie came easily, practiced in her mind during the drive over. He nodded slowly. "The stones are natural diamonds, old cut, probably European, from the early to mid-20th century. The setting is platinum. Quality is excellent." He paused. "This is a significant piece. What does that mean?" He named a figure that made Emma's grip tighten on the edge of the counter. Then he added, "That's a conservative estimate. At auction. With the right buyers, it could go higher." Emma forced herself to remain calm. "I'd like to sell it." The jeweler's expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes. "I can make you an offer. It will be below market value. That's the nature of buying for resale. If you want full value, you should consign it to an auction house. How long would that take?" "Months, possibly longer." She did not have months. "What's your offer?" He named a figure lower than his initial estimate, but still substantial enough to stop the eviction, pay the overdue bills, and leave her with breathing room she had not experienced in over a year. Emma agreed before she could reconsider. The transaction was completed with minimal paperwork. Cash handed over in sealed envelopes that felt too heavy for their size. The jeweler asked no additional questions. Emma left the shop feeling both relief and unease. She had claimed a piece of the hidden wealth, but she had also confirmed that it was real, and reality brought complications. Over the next 2 weeks, she returned to the jeweler with 3 more pieces. The amounts varied, but together they represented enough to stabilize her immediate circumstances. She paid the back rent in full, settled the medical bills, and established a small emergency fund. For the first time since the divorce, she could look at her bank account without feeling the tightness in her chest that had become her constant companion. But the bonds and stock certificates remained untouched in the hidden compartment. They represented wealth on a different scale, and claiming them would require steps she was not yet ready to take. The jewelry had been personal property, easy to authenticate, difficult to trace. The financial instruments were different. They carried serial numbers, institutional connections, paper trails that could expose questions about their origin. Emma began researching lawyers who specialized in estate settlements and asset recovery. She needed advice from someone who understood the legal complexities and who had experience navigating the gray areas between legitimate inheritance and unexplained wealth. But lawyers cost money, and the kind of expertise she needed cost more. She chose carefully, selecting a firm that advertised experience with international estates and complex probate matters. The initial consultation fee was steep, but manageable now that she had resources. She scheduled an appointment for the following week, using a name other than her own and paying in cash to preserve as much anonymity as possible. The law office occupied 3 floors of a modern building downtown, its interior all glass and polished steel. Emma felt out of place in her work clothes, but the receptionist treated her with the same polite efficiency reserved for all clients. She was directed to a conference room where a lawyer named Harriet Moss waited. Moss was in her 50s, her gray hair cut short, her manner direct without being cold. She listened while Emma explained the situation, her expression remaining neutral even as the scope of the inheritance became clear. When Emma finished, Moss leaned back in her chair and was quiet for several long moments. "Your grandfather left you an armoire," she said finally. "And that armoire contained undisclosed assets." "Yes. Were these assets mentioned specifically in the will?" "Only as contents. No inventory was provided." Moss nodded slowly. "That creates complications. Without documentation, you'll need to establish provenance and legitimacy for each asset category. Bearer bonds and old stock certificates are particularly problematic. They're difficult to redeem without raising questions." "What kind of questions?" how they were obtained, why they were hidden, whether taxes were paid when they were originally acquired. Moss paused. The government tends to assume the worst in these situations. You'll need to prove otherwise. Emma felt the familiar tightness returning to her chest. Is that possible? It depends on what documentation you can provide. Do you have access to your grandfather's financial records, tax returns, any correspondence related to these assets? No, he didn't leave anything like that. Then you'll need to build a case based on what you do have. The will establishing that the armoire and its contents were left to you. Evidence that your grandfather owned these assets for decades. Testimony from family members or associates who might corroborate his possession of valuable items. My family thinks the armoire is worthless, Emma said quietly. They mocked me for taking it. Moss's expression softened slightly. That might actually work in your favor. If the contents were unknown even to close family, it supports the idea that your grandfather concealed them intentionally, which suggests he had reason to. What kind of reason? That's what you'll need to determine. Was he fleeing political instability, protecting assets from potential seizure, evading taxes? Moss held up a hand before Emma could respond. I'm not accusing your grandfather of anything. I'm explaining what investigators will ask. The consultation lasted another hour. By the end, Emma had a clearer picture of the path ahead. It would be slow, expensive, and uncertain. She would need appraisals, expert testimony, potentially international research into her grandfather's background. Every step would create records, involve people, generate questions. And there was no guarantee of success. Moss was careful to emphasize that point. Even with perfect documentation, the government could decide that the assets had been obtained illegally or that taxes had not been properly paid. In that scenario, Emma could lose everything and face penalties on top of the loss. You need to decide how much risk you're willing to accept, Moss said as they concluded. You could walk away now, return the bonds and certificates to the hidden compartment, pretend you never found them. The jewelry you've already sold is less traceable. If questions arise, you can claim ignorance. Or you can fight for it, properly, transparently, knowing that transparency might cost you everything. Emma left the office with a folder of materials and a sense that she had crossed another invisible line. The discovery in the armoire was no longer just hers. It had been witnessed, documented, entered into professional records. The secret was beginning to leak, and once that process started, it could not be reversed. That evening, she stood in Lily's bedroom and studied the armoire with new eyes. The scratches on its surface, the tarnished brass handles, the elaborate carvings that had seemed merely decorative. All of it was evidence now. Evidence of a journey across an ocean, of a life left behind, of choices made by a man she had barely known. Her phone rang. Claire's name appeared on the screen. Emma almost did not answer, but something made her pick up. I heard you sold some of grandmother's jewelry, Claire said without preamble. Mrs. Chen mentioned seeing you at an estate jeweler. The tightness in Emma's chest intensified. It was mine. Grandfather left it to me. In that armoire? Yes. There was a pause. When Claire spoke again, her tone had changed, sharpening into something closer to accusation. What else is in there, Emma? Just old things. Linens. Photographs. That's all. Emma closed her eyes. The lie felt heavier this time, weighted by the consultation with Moss, by the cash hidden in her apartment, by the bonds and certificates still waiting in the hidden compartment. That's all. You'd tell me if there was anything valuable, right? We could split it. That would be fair. There's nothing to split. The conversation ended shortly after, but Emma knew it would not be the last. Claire's suspicion had been activated, and suspicion had a way of spreading. Soon their mother would be asking questions. Then cousins, uncles, people who had dismissed the armoire as worthless, but who would recalibrate quickly if they suspected it contained value. The secret was eroding faster than Emma had anticipated, and with its erosion came a question she could no longer avoid. How much of what her grandfather had left her was she willing to fight for? And how much of herself would she have to reveal in the process? The armoire stood silent against the wall, its hidden compartment sealed, its treasures concealed. But Emma understood now that concealment had an expiration date. The discovery had set events in motion that would not stop simply because she wished they would. Whatever came next would be determined not by what she had found, but by what she chose to do with it. The weeks that followed carried a tension Emma had never experienced before. It was not the sharp panic of unpaid bills or the dread of eviction notices. It was slower, more insidious. The kind of pressure that accumulated in silence and expressed itself through small disruptions that compounded over time. She woke each morning aware that the armoire stood in her daughter's bedroom, that its hidden compartment contained assets she could not yet claim, and that every day she delayed was a day someone else might discover what she was protecting. Claire called twice more, her questions increasingly pointed. Had Emma found anything else in the armoire? Had she checked all the drawers thoroughly? Would it be possible to have the piece appraised just to confirm it was truly worthless? Emma deflected each inquiry with careful vagueness, aware that her sister's persistence stemmed from something deeper than casual curiosity. Claire had sensed a shift in Emma's circumstances. The rent had been paid. The constant worry that had shadowed their conversations for months had eased. People who struggled did not suddenly stabilize without explanation. Their mother called as well, her approach more direct. "Claire tells me you've been selling jewelry." "Just a few pieces," Emma said. "Things grandmother left in the armoire." "I didn't know there was jewelry." "Neither did I until I sorted through everything." The pause that followed carried weight. Her mother was not easily fooled, and silence was her preferred tool for extracting truth. Emma held her ground, saying nothing, waiting for the next question. "If there's anything valuable in that furniture, Emma, it should be divided fairly. Your grandfather left it to you, but that doesn't mean you should keep everything without consulting the family." The words landed with precision. This was not a request. It was an expectation framed as moral guidance. Emma felt anger rise in her chest, sharp and defensive. She had been dismissed, mocked, given a burden no one else wanted, and now that the burden showed signs of value, fairness suddenly mattered. "He left it to me specifically," Emma said, her voice quiet but firm. "The will was clear." The will mentioned an armoire. It didn't mention hidden assets. So Claire had been talking. The narrative was being constructed, piece by piece. The inheritance that should have been shared. The daughter who was keeping secrets. The family being excluded from what rightfully belonged to everyone. "There are no hidden assets," Emma lied. "Just some old jewelry that turned out to be worth more than I expected." Her mother's response was measured, but Emma heard the doubt beneath it. "I hope that's true. Because if you're hiding things, Emma, it will come out eventually. And when it does, you'll lose more than money." The call ended shortly after, leaving Emma staring at her phone with a sense that the ground was shifting beneath her. The family's skepticism had transformed into active suspicion. They would not let this rest. If she moved forward with claiming the bonds and stock certificates, if she involved lawyers and authenticators, the news would spread. Claire would hear about it. Her mother would demand answers. The inheritance that was meant to solve her problems would create new ones she had not anticipated. She contacted Harriet Moss again, explaining the change in circumstances. The lawyer listened without interruption, then delivered her assessment with characteristic directness. Family disputes over estates are common and messy. If your relatives believe you're withholding assets that should be shared, they can contest the will. They can claim undue influence, mental incompetence, fraud. Even if those claims are baseless, defending against them costs time and money. But the will was explicit, Emma said. He left the armoire and its contents to me. Contents is a vague term. A judge might interpret that to mean only what was visible and known at the time of his death. If assets were hidden so thoroughly that even your grandfather's closest family had no knowledge of them, an argument could be made that they fall outside the scope of the bequest. Emma felt the familiar tightness return. So, I could lose everything. Or you could negotiate. Offer your family a portion in exchange for their agreement not to contest. It's not ideal, but it would allow you to move forward without legal entanglement. The suggestion sat heavily. Giving Claire and her mother a share meant admitting the assets existed. It meant exposing the full scope of what she had found, subjecting it to scrutiny and division. It meant watching people who had dismissed her need walk away with wealth that had been specifically designated for her. But the alternative was fighting a battle on multiple fronts, against family and bureaucracy simultaneously, with resources she did not have and expertise she would need to purchase. Emma thanked Moss and ended the call without committing to a plan. She sat in her apartment, surrounded by the ordinary debris of daily life, Lily's toys scattered across the floor, dishes waiting in the sink, mail piled on the counter, and felt the weight of decisions that had consequences she could not fully predict. The next complication arrived from an unexpected direction. Emma received a letter from the estate executor, a lawyer who had overseen the distribution of her grandfather's assets. The tone was formal, inquiring about the status of the armoire. Had it been moved? Was it in her possession? The executor needed to confirm that all bequests had been received and accounted for before closing the estate officially. Emma responded truthfully. The armoire was in her apartment. She had taken possession, as specified in the will. The response she received 3 days later was more pointed. The executor had been contacted by another family member, raising questions about the armoire's contents. To avoid potential disputes, the executor was requesting that Emma provide an inventory of what she had found inside the piece. There it was, the formal mechanism through which secrets became public record. If Emma listed the bonds, the certificates, the jewelry, it would all be documented, filed, potentially taxed. If she omitted them, she would be lying in an official capacity, exposing herself to legal consequences that extended beyond family conflict. She consulted Moss again, and this time the lawyer's advice was unambiguous. Do not provide a detailed inventory without legal representation. Once you commit information to writing in response to an executor's request, it becomes part of the estate record. Anything you disclose can be used to challenge the distribution. What should I do? Respond that you're compiling the inventory and will provide it through your attorney. Then hire me formally so I can manage the communication and protect your interests. The retainer Moss required was substantial but necessary. Emma paid it from the funds she had received from selling the jewelry, feeling the bitter irony of using money from the hidden assets to defend her right to the remaining hidden assets. But it was the only path that offered any protection. Over the next several weeks, Emma's life bifurcated into two parallel realities. In one, she continued working at the warehouse, taking Lily to school, managing the small routines that defined her days. In the other, she navigated a complex legal and financial landscape that demanded constant attention and drained her reserves of patience and hope. Moss began the process of authenticating the bearer bonds. This required submitting them to the Treasury Department with documentation proving legitimate ownership. The bonds themselves were genuine, their serial numbers verified against historical records. But the Treasury's response was cautious. Bearer bonds issued before 1982 could still be redeemed, but the holder needed to demonstrate a clear chain of custody. Without that, the redemption would be flagged for investigation. Emma provided what she could: a copy of the will, photographs of the armoire showing the hidden compartment, a sworn statement describing how and when she discovered the bonds. It was not enough. The Treasury requested additional documentation, evidence that her grandfather had purchased the bonds originally, tax records showing they had been declared as assets, correspondence proving they had been in his possession for the duration of their existence. None of that existed. Or if it did, it had been destroyed, lost, or concealed as thoroughly as the bonds themselves. The stock certificates presented similar challenges. Most of the companies had merged or restructured over the decades. Tracing the lineage of shares from original issue to current ownership required specialized research that cost money and time. Some certificates retained value. Others had been diluted or dissolved entirely. Without expert analysis, Emma could not determine which category each certificate belonged to. She hired a financial historian, recommended by Moss, a man who specialized in tracking legacy assets through corporate transformations. His initial assessment was cautiously optimistic. Several of the certificates represented shares in companies that had grown substantially since the 1950s. If Emma could prove legitimate ownership, the current value could be significant. But proof remained elusive. The certificates bore her grandfather's name in faded ink, but there was no accompanying documentation, no purchase receipts, no brokerage statements, no letters confirming the transactions. Just the certificates themselves, elegant and official and frustratingly incomplete. The financial historian suggested a different approach. Instead of trying to redeem the certificates directly, Emma could work with a specialized broker who dealt in legacy securities. These brokers had relationships with transfer agents and corporate archives. They knew how to navigate the bureaucratic maze of proving ownership when traditional documentation was absent. The process would be slower and the fees substantial, but it offered a path forward. Emma agreed to the approach, signing contracts that committed her to paying percentages of whatever value was ultimately recovered. The broker began his work, submitting requests to corporate offices, cross-referencing historical records, building a case piece by piece. Months passed. Spring turned to summer. Lily finished second grade and started a day camp that Emma could now afford without anxiety. The apartment remained the same, but the pressure inside it had shifted. The armoire still dominated Lily's bedroom, its presence a constant reminder of what it contained and what remained unresolved. Claire stopped calling, which worried Emma more than the previous persistence. Silence suggested strategy. Her sister was not someone who let things go. She waited, observed, and acted when the moment offered advantage. The strategy revealed itself in early July. Emma received a formal letter from an attorney representing Claire and their mother. The letter outlined a claim against the estate, arguing that the armoire's hidden contents constituted undisclosed assets that should have been divided among all heirs. The claim cited precedents in estate law where hidden valuables were ruled to fall outside specific bequests and into the general estate distribution. Moss read the letter and delivered her assessment without sugarcoating the implications. This is serious. They're not just asking for a share. They're arguing that you never had a legitimate claim to the hidden assets in the first place. Can they do that? They can try. Whether they'll succeed depends on how a judge interprets the will's language and your grandfather's intent. Moss paused. The problem is, we don't know what his intent was. He left you the armoire and its contents, but he never told anyone what those contents included. That ambiguity works against you. Emma felt anger crystallize into something harder and clearer. He left it to me, specifically. While everyone else got things with obvious value, he gave me something they all mocked. And now that it turns out to be valuable, they want to take it. I understand your frustration, but the law doesn't care about fairness in the emotional sense. It cares about procedure and interpretation. The legal battle that followed consumed Emma's attention and resources with relentless efficiency. Moss filed a response denying the claim and asserting Emma's exclusive right to the armoire and everything it contained. Claire's attorney countered with depositions, demanding detailed inventories and appraisals. The executor was pulled into the dispute, his role shifting from administrator to witness as both sides sought his testimony about the will's intent. Emma was deposed in a conference room that smelled of filtered air and expensive furniture. Claire's attorney, a man in his 40s, with the polished confidence of someone who handled these disputes routinely, asked questions designed to expose inconsistency or deception. "When did you first discover the hidden compartment?" Emma answered carefully, aware that every word was being recorded. "Approximately 2 weeks after I moved the armoire to my apartment." "And you immediately informed the executor?" "No." "Why not?" "I wasn't sure what I had found. I wanted to understand it before involving others." The attorney leaned forward slightly. "Or you wanted to hide it?" Moss objected, but the insinuation had been planted. Throughout the deposition, the narrative being constructed was clear. Emma had discovered valuable assets and concealed them, violating the spirit of the will, if not the letter. She was being positioned as opportunistic, deceptive, someone who could not be trusted to honor family obligations. When Claire was deposed, her testimony was measured and sympathetic. She had worried about Emma's financial situation. She had encouraged her to take the armoire despite its apparent worthlessness. She had been shocked to learn that Emma was selling jewelry and claiming it came from their grandmother. She wanted to believe her sister was acting in good faith, but the secrecy suggested otherwise. Their mother's testimony was briefer, but more damaging. She confirmed that the family had no knowledge of valuable assets in the armoire. She expressed concern that her father, in his final years, may not have been fully aware of what he was bequeathing. She suggested that if he had known the true value of the hidden contents, he would have wanted them distributed fairly among all his descendants. Emma watched her family testify through the filter of legal proceedings. Their words stripped of warmth and reduced to strategic positioning. She understood that this was what inheritance disputes did. They transformed relationships into adversarial positions, replaced history with competing narratives. The case moved through the court system with the grinding slowness characteristic of probate disputes. Months accumulated. Legal fees mounted. Emma's share of the jewelry money was depleted systematically, first by retainer fees, then by hourly billing, then by expert witness costs and filing fees, and all the small expenses that accompanied formal litigation. Moss remained optimistic, or at least presented optimism during their meetings. The law favored specific bequests over general estate claims. Emma had received the armoire and its contents explicitly. Unless Claire could prove that their grandfather did not intend to include hidden assets in that bequest, the claim would likely fail. But proving intent was complex when the person whose intent mattered was dead and had left no written explanation. The case became an exercise in interpretation, with each side marshaling evidence to support their version of what her grandfather had meant when he wrote the will. During this period, Emma learned things about her grandfather that she had never known and that changed her understanding of the inheritance entirely. Moss hired a researcher to investigate his background, looking for documentation that might explain the hidden assets and support Emma's claim to them. The researcher uncovered records from the early 1950s, fragmentary but revealing. Emma's grandfather had not simply immigrated to America with his young wife and an armoire full of valuables. He had fled. The details were sparse, buried in immigration documents and archived newspaper articles, but the outline was clear. He had worked for a bank in Paris, a position that gave him access to client accounts and institutional assets. In the years following World War II, Europe was a landscape of collapsed governments and shifting borders. People who had hidden wealth during the war began trying to recover it. Some succeeded. Others found that their assets had been seized, redistributed, or simply vanished into administrative confusion. Emma's grandfather had been part of the machinery that processed these claims. The researcher found his name on documents related to several disputed accounts, cases where ownership was unclear and resolution depended on interpretation of conflicting records. Then, in late 1951, his name disappeared from the bank's records. No resignation letter, no transfer notice. He simply stopped appearing. 6 months later, he arrived in the United States with his wife and a shipping manifest that listed household goods and personal effects. Among the items, one antique armoire, purchased in France. The implications were clear, even if the specifics remained hidden. Her grandfather had left France under circumstances that suggested urgency rather than planned migration. He had brought with him assets that he could not or would not leave behind, concealing them in furniture designed for that purpose. And he had lived the rest of his life in quiet anonymity, never returning to France, never discussing his past employment, never revealing what he had carried across the ocean. Whether those assets had been obtained legally was a question the researcher could not answer definitively. The bank he worked for no longer existed in its original form. Its records had been absorbed into successor institutions whose archives were incomplete. But the timing suggested that her grandfather had taken advantage of the chaos following the war to acquire bearer bonds, stock certificates, and valuables that might otherwise have been recovered by their rightful owners or seized by authorities. Emma sat with this knowledge for several days, turning it over in her mind like an object whose shape kept changing depending on the angle. Her grandfather was not a simple man who had saved carefully and hidden his wealth out of caution. He was someone who had operated in a gray zone between legality and opportunism, who had seen a moment when valuable assets were vulnerable and had acted to claim them. It complicated her moral position. The wealth she was fighting to keep might itself have been taken from people who had lost everything in the war. The bonds and certificates might represent someone else's stolen security, hidden a second time in an armoire that crossed an ocean. But it did not change the legal reality. Whatever her grandfather had done, he had bequeathed the armoire and its contents to her. The will was clear. The inheritance was hers, unless a court decided otherwise. Moss incorporated the research into their legal strategy, carefully. The historical context supported the argument that her grandfather had deliberately concealed these assets, which meant he had deliberately included them in the bequest to Emma. The circumstances of his immigration explained why he had hidden them so thoroughly. He had been protecting himself from potential investigation, from questions about how he had obtained them. Claire's attorney seized on the same research to argue the opposite. If the assets had been obtained illegally or unethically, they were tainted property that should not be honored as a legitimate inheritance. They should be forfeited or at minimum distributed according to principles of fairness rather than specific bequest. The legal battle became philosophical, debating what it meant to inherit not just objects, but the moral complications attached to them. Judges asked questions about intent, legitimacy, and the limits of a testator's power to bequeath assets whose origins were unclear. Emma attended every hearing, sitting in courtrooms that smelled of old wood and watching lawyers argue over the meaning of words her grandfather had written before he died. She saw Claire across the aisle, their mother beside her, both of them presenting a united front. They did not make eye contact. The family had fractured along a line drawn by hidden wealth, and the gap was widening with each motion filed and each deposition taken. During one particularly contentious hearing, the judge asked Emma directly why she believed her grandfather had left the armoire specifically to her rather than dividing its contents among all his descendants. Emma stood, her voice steady despite the nervousness that made her hands tremble. Because everyone else got things they wanted, things with obvious value, things they could use or sell easily. He gave me something no one else wanted, something they mocked me for accepting. I think he knew I would take it even when it seemed worthless. And I think that's why he trusted me with what was inside. The judge's expression did not change, but something in his posture suggested he had heard her. The hearing continued, but Emma felt that her answer had mattered in a way legal arguments could not. The case was decided on a cold morning in October, nearly a year after Emma had discovered the hidden compartment. The courtroom was half empty, the proceedings attended only by those directly involved and a handful of observers with professional interest in estate law. The judge's ruling was methodical, walking through precedents and interpretations with the careful language of someone aware that his decision would be scrutinized. He noted the ambiguity in the will's language. He acknowledged the family's legitimate questions about whether hidden assets fell within the scope of a specific bequest. He recognized the moral complexities raised by the assets' unclear origins. Then he ruled in Emma's favor. The armoire and all its contents, known and unknown at the time of bequest, belonged to Emma Chen exclusively. The specificity of the bequest overrode general estate distribution principles. The testator's intent, while not explicitly documented, could be reasonably inferred from the deliberate nature of concealment and the specificity with which the armoire had been designated for Emma alone. Claire and their mother could contest the ruling, but the judge's reasoning was sound, and appeals were expensive. Moss advised that they would likely not proceed further. The legal battle was over. Emma left the courthouse feeling not triumph, but exhaustion. She had won the right to keep what her grandfather had left her, but the victory was hollow. Her relationship with her family had been irreparably damaged. The money she had spent on legal fees would take years to recover, even if she successfully redeemed all the bonds and certificates. And she still carried the knowledge that the wealth she was fighting for might have come from morally compromised origins. That evening, she stood in Lily's bedroom and looked at the armoire. Its dark wood seemed heavier somehow, weighted not just by its physical mass, but by everything it represented. A man's flight from his past, a family's dissolution over hidden wealth, a woman's struggle to claim what had been given to her while navigating systems designed to question her legitimacy. She opened the hidden compartment and removed one of the oilcloth packages. Inside were bonds that still needed to be redeemed, certificates that still required authentication, a process that would take months more and cost money she no longer had in abundance. But she had won the right to try. The armoire was hers. Its contents were hers. Whatever came next would be her burden to carry, her decision to make. Emma wrapped the package carefully and returned it to the hidden space. She closed the panel, listening for the soft click that indicated it had locked. Tomorrow she would contact the broker handling the stock certificates. She would follow up with the Treasury about the bonds. She would continue the slow, difficult work of transforming hidden assets into accessible wealth. But tonight, she simply stood in the quiet apartment, her daughter asleep in the next room, and acknowledged the weight of what she had inherited. Not just money or valuables, but complexity. Not just opportunity, but consequence. The armoire would stay in Lily's bedroom. It was too large to move again, and Emma no longer had the energy to consider selling it. It had served its purpose, concealing what needed to be concealed until the right person found it. Whether Emma was the right person remained an open question. But she was the person her grandfather had chosen, and that would have to be enough. Outside, the city continued its rhythms. People moved through their lives, carrying burdens and blessings that others could not see. Emma was one of them now, someone whose struggles were invisible from the outside, whose wealth was complicated by the price it demanded. She turned off the light and left the room, the armoire's shadow falling across the floor behind her. The discovery that had started with a simple mechanism hidden in wood had transformed into something larger than she had imagined. And though the legal battle was over, she understood that the real work was just beginning. The inheritance was hers. Now she had to decide what to do with it. The process of redemption began in earnest the week after the court ruling. Emma contacted the specialized broker Moss had recommended, a man named Richard Castellano, who operated from an office in Lower Manhattan that felt more like an archive than a place of business. The walls were lined with filing cabinets and reference books, some so old their spines had cracked and faded. Castellano himself was in his 70s, his hand steady despite his age, his manner patient in the way of someone who had spent decades untangling complications that others had given up on. He examined the stock certificates with a magnifying glass, checking watermarks and security features, comparing serial numbers against databases that existed only in printed form because the companies that issued them had dissolved before the digital age. Each certificate required individual research. Some were straightforward, their lineage clear through documented mergers and acquisitions. Others were mysteries that would take months to solve, if they could be solved at all. This one, Castellano said, holding up a certificate issued by a manufacturing company Emma had never heard of, merged with a larger firm in 1968. That firm was acquired in 1985. The acquiring company still exists, and they honor legacy shares. But you'll need to prove continuous ownership from issue to present. How do I do that? Affidavits, documentation showing your grandfather possessed these certificates, evidence that they were never sold or transferred. It's circumstantial proof, but it's often the best we can do with assets this old. Emma signed the contracts that gave Castellano authority to act on her behalf. His fees were substantial, 20% of whatever value he recovered, but she had no other options. The alternative was attempting to navigate the bureaucracy herself, which Moss had made clear would be nearly impossible without specialized expertise. The bearer bonds were handled through a different channel. The Treasury Department's process for redeeming old bonds was Byzantine, designed more to discourage fraud than to facilitate legitimate claims. Emma submitted the documentation Moss had prepared, including the court ruling affirming her ownership. The response came 6 weeks later, a form letter stating that her claim was under review and that additional information might be requested. Months passed again. Emma returned to her routine at the warehouse, the legal victory receding into background noise as immediate concerns reasserted themselves. Lily needed winter clothes. The car required the repairs Emma had been postponing. The apartment remained the same, though Emma found herself noticing its limitations more acutely now. The walls that needed repainting, the kitchen cabinets that hung slightly crooked, the bathroom tile that had cracked and never been replaced. She had won the right to wealth, but did not yet possess it. The gap between legal ownership and actual access felt like a chasm she could not cross without help from institutions that moved at their own pace, indifferent to her needs. Claire did not contact her after the ruling. Their mother called once, briefly, her voice formal and distant. She wanted to know if Emma planned to attend Thanksgiving. The question was asked without warmth, a procedural inquiry rather than an invitation. Emma declined, citing work commitments that were not real but felt necessary as an excuse. "I hope you're satisfied," her mother said before hanging up. "You've gotten what you wanted." The words stung more than Emma expected. She had not wanted a legal battle. She had not wanted to fracture her family. She had simply wanted to keep what her grandfather had left her, and the price of that decision had been higher than the value of any asset hidden in the armoire. The first breakthrough came in December. Castellano called with news about one of the stock certificates. The company had honored the legacy shares, and after adjusting for splits and mergers over 7 decades, Emma's certificate represented a position worth $42,000. The check arrived a week later, made out to her name, the amount printed in bold numbers that seemed almost surreal. She deposited it immediately, watching the balance in her account transform from modest to substantial. It was the first tangible proof that the hidden assets were not just legal abstractions, but actual wealth that could be accessed and used. Emma sat in her car in the bank parking lot and cried, not from happiness exactly, but from relief so profound it overwhelmed her composure. 2 more certificates were redeemed over the following months, each yielding amounts that varied widely. One brought $30,000. Another, from a company that had grown into a major corporation, brought $96,000. The money accumulated in her account, each deposit a small vindication of the year she had spent fighting for the right to claim what her grandfather had left her. The bearer bonds took longer. The Treasury Department's investigation was thorough and impersonal. They requested additional documentation, then more documentation, then interviews with Emma about how she had come to possess the bonds and what she knew about their origin. She answered truthfully, aware that any inconsistency could derail the entire process. In March, nearly 18 months after she had discovered the hidden compartment, the Treasury approved her claim for the first batch of bonds. The amount was staggering. Each $10,000 bond had accumulated decades of interest, compounding at rates that transformed their face value into something far larger. The total redemption for the first 15 bonds exceeded $300,000. The check arrived via certified mail. Emma signed for it with hands that shook, then opened the envelope in her apartment while Lily was at school. She read the amount 3 times, each reading confirming what she could barely process. This was not temporary relief. This was transformation. She called Moss immediately. The lawyer's response was professional, but carried an undertone of genuine satisfaction. "Congratulations, you've earned this." "What about taxes?" "You'll owe federal and state taxes on the redemption. But even after that, you're looking at enough to change your life substantially." Emma had already been calculating in her mind. She could pay off all remaining debts. She could move to a better apartment, one with space for Lily to have a bedroom that was actually hers, rather than shared with an oversized armoire. She could establish a real savings account, the kind that would survive emergencies rather than evaporate at the first unexpected expense. She could stop living in the constant state of defensive anxiety that had defined her existence since the divorce. The remaining bonds were approved in stages over the next several months. Each batch brought another wave of money that seemed impossible, even as it appeared in her account. By summer, the total value of redeemed bonds exceeded $800,000. After taxes, Emma was left with more money than she had earned in her entire adult life combined. The stock certificates continued to be processed. Some yielded modest amounts. Others, particularly those from companies that had grown substantially since the 1950s, brought 6-figure sums. Castellano called every few weeks with updates, his voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone who enjoyed solving puzzles that others had deemed unsolvable. The jewelry and diamonds that remained in the hidden compartment were appraised by an independent expert Moss recommended. The values confirmed what Emma had suspected. The pieces were worth significantly more than she had received from the jeweler who had bought the first items. But she did not regret those early sales. They had been necessary survival measures, made when she had no other options. By the time autumn arrived again, 2 years after her grandfather's death, Emma had accessed assets totaling more than $2 million. Even after legal fees, taxes, and the various costs associated with authentication and redemption, she was left with wealth that fundamentally altered her circumstances. She moved in October, choosing an apartment in a neighborhood with better schools and safer streets. The new place had 2 real bedrooms, hardwood floors that did not creak, and windows that actually sealed against the weather. Lily's room had space for a proper bed, a desk, bookshelves, all the furniture that children were supposed to have, but that Emma had never been able to afford. The armoire came with them, transported by professional movers, who handled it with the care Emma now understood. It deserved. It was placed in her own bedroom this time, against a wall, where it no longer blocked windows or dominated space meant for someone else. In the new apartment, the armoire looked different. Not beautiful exactly, but dignified. A piece that had survived a journey across an ocean and decades of concealment to deliver its purpose exactly when it was needed most. Emma kept the hidden compartment empty now. The bonds and certificates had all been redeemed or were in process. The remaining jewelry sat in a safe deposit box at a bank, whose staff treated her with the courtesy reserved for valued clients. The armoire was just furniture again, though she found herself touching its dark wood sometimes, running her fingers along the carved patterns, acknowledging silently what it had meant. She quit her job at the warehouse without drama or ceremony. Her supervisor accepted the resignation with polite surprise, and Emma left without explaining why. Some transformations were too complicated to summarize in the break room. She enrolled in community college courses, something she had abandoned years earlier when Lily was born, and survival took precedence over education. The classes were challenging in ways that felt good rather than overwhelming. She studied business administration, thinking vaguely about opening something of her own someday, though the specifics remained unclear. Lily thrived in the new school. She made friends whose parents invited them over for playdates in houses that were clean and organized. Emma accepted the invitations without the shame that had prevented her from reciprocating in the old apartment. She could host now. She had space, resources, the appearance of stability that other parents recognized and respected. The social transformation was subtle but profound. Emma was no longer the struggling single mother whose circumstances everyone pitied. She was simply another parent, navigating the ordinary challenges of raising a child, attending school events, participating in class activities. The financial pressure that had colored every interaction was gone, and its absence changed how people responded to her. But the wealth brought complications that Emma had not anticipated. Friends from her old life treated her differently once they learned about the inheritance. Some became distant, as though her improved circumstances created a barrier that had not existed when they shared similar struggles. Others became overly interested, asking questions about investments and opportunities that Emma had no expertise to answer. She found herself lying sometimes, downplaying the scale of the inheritance, describing it as modest rather than life-changing. The truth felt too large to share casually, and she had learned through experience that money made people calculate relationships differently. Claire reached out again in November, a year after the court ruling. The message was brief and carefully worded. She wanted to apologize for how things had unfolded. She hoped they could repair their relationship. She would understand if Emma needed more time. Emma read the message 3 times, searching for subtext. The apology seemed genuine, but sincerity was difficult to assess through text. She responded cautiously, suggesting coffee rather than committing to reconciliation. They met the following week at a cafe neither of them had been to before, neutral ground that carried no history. Claire looked the same, perhaps slightly older, the lines around her eyes more pronounced. She ordered carefully, paid for her own coffee, made small talk about her children and her work. Then, after enough time had passed to suggest the transition was planned rather than impulsive, she addressed what they were both thinking about. "I was wrong," Claire said. "About the armoire, about how I treated you." Emma waited, not helping her through the admission. "I thought you were taking something that should have been shared. I thought grandfather made a mistake, or that you were taking advantage of his confusion." Claire paused, her coffee cup held between both hands. "But the more I thought about it, the more I realized he knew exactly what he was doing. He gave you something no one else wanted because he knew you would value it beyond its appearance. Or because I was desperate enough to take anything," Emma said quietly. "Maybe. But that's its own kind of wisdom, isn't it? Knowing who needs something most." They talked for another hour, carefully navigating around the sharpest edges of what had happened. The conversation did not heal everything. Trust had been damaged in ways that could not be repaired quickly. But it was a beginning, tentative and fragile, acknowledging that family ties persisted even when complicated by conflict. Their mother did not apologize, but she softened in other ways. She invited Emma to Christmas dinner, the invitation extended through Claire, but carrying no conditions. Emma accepted, bringing Lily and a carefully chosen gift that was neither too expensive nor too modest. The dinner was awkward at first, everyone hyper-aware of the year that had passed and the things that had been said. But Lily's presence helped. Her child's obliviousness to adult tensions creating space for others to relax. By the end of the evening, something had shifted. They were not healed, but they were no longer actively broken. The inheritance had fractured them, but time and careful effort were beginning to soften the edges of that fracture. Emma continued working with Castellano on the remaining stock certificates. Several had proven impossible to redeem, the companies having dissolved without clear successors. But others yielded value that kept surprising her. One certificate, from a small technology firm that had been acquired by IBM in the 1960s, was ultimately worth $340,000 after adjustments for decades of corporate restructuring. The final accounting came in spring, nearly 3 years after the discovery of the hidden compartment. When all assets had been liquidated, authenticated, and deposited, Emma's net worth exceeded $2.7 million. After every fee, every tax, every cost associated with claiming what her grandfather had left her, she possessed wealth that placed her firmly in the category of people who did not worry about money in the ways she had worried for most of her adult life. But the number in her account felt less significant than the changes it had enabled. She no longer checked her balance compulsively. She no longer calculated whether she could afford small purchases. She no longer felt the tightness in her chest that had accompanied every unexpected expense. The transformation was internal as much as external. Emma moved through the world differently now, with a confidence that came from knowing she had options. When the car needed repairs, she scheduled them without anxiety. When Lily wanted to try violin lessons, Emma signed her up without calculating what it would cost. When opportunities appeared, personal or professional, she could consider them based on interest rather than necessity. She thought about her grandfather often, trying to understand the man who had concealed so much and revealed so little. The research Moss had commissioned suggested he had been opportunistic, possibly unethical, someone who had taken advantage of post-war chaos to acquire assets that might not have been rightfully his. But he had also been practical, protective of what he had gained, careful to preserve it for a future he would not live to see. Emma wondered if he had known what the inheritance would mean to her specifically. Whether he had anticipated that she would be struggling when he died, that the armoire would arrive at precisely the moment she needed it most, or whether it had been simpler than that, a decision to leave something valuable to a grandchild who had visited him occasionally and treated him with kindness even when he had little to offer in return. She would never know his reasoning, but she understood the gift now, not just the wealth, but the complexity that came with it. Her grandfather had left her something that would demand effort to claim, that would test her determination, that would require her to fight for what was being given to her. He had not made it easy, but he had made it possible. One evening in June, 3 years after the discovery, Emma stood in her bedroom and opened the armoire's hidden compartment one final time. It was empty now, all its contents claimed and converted into assets that existed in accounts and safe deposit boxes rather than wrapped in oilcloth. She ran her fingers along the smooth interior surface, feeling the grooves where the panel had slid, the mechanism that had concealed so much for so long. She thought about leaving a note there, something for whoever might discover the hidden space decades from now. But what could she say that would capture what this inheritance had meant? The struggle, the doubt, the transformation, the price. Words felt inadequate. Instead, she closed the panel and listened for the soft click that indicated it had locked. The compartment was empty, but the armoire remained. It would be part of her household for as long as she chose to keep it. A reminder of where wealth had come from and what it had cost to claim. Lily appeared in the doorway, holding a book she wanted Emma to read to her. She was 9 years old now, growing into a person whose life would be shaped by advantages Emma had fought to provide. She would attend good schools. She would have opportunities that had not been available to her mother. She would grow up without the constant pressure of financial instability that had defined Emma's own childhood. "What are you doing?" Lily asked. "Just looking at the armoire?" "It's still ugly." Emma smiled. "I know, but it's ours." They moved to the living room, where Emma read aloud while Lily leaned against her, the ordinary comfort of an evening routine. Outside, the city continued its rhythms, full of people carrying their own burdens and blessings, their own hidden complications. Emma had learned that wealth did not solve everything. It did not heal relationships automatically. It did not erase the memory of struggle or transform a person into someone entirely new. But it created space to breathe, to choose, to build something that resembled the life she had imagined before everything had collapsed. The inheritance from her grandfather had been more than money. It had been a test of her willingness to claim what others dismissed, to fight for what seemed impossible, to persist when systems and people told her to walk away. She had passed that test, though not without cost. Her family had been damaged. Her sense of her grandfather's character had been complicated. Her own innocence about how wealth was acquired and preserved had been shattered. But she had also gained something that could not be measured in dollars. She had learned that she was capable of enduring more than she had believed, that she could navigate complexity without being destroyed by it, that she could transform desperation into determination and use that determination to claim a future that had once seemed completely out of reach. The armoire stood in her bedroom, dark and stolid, its secrets revealed and its purpose fulfilled. It had carried a hidden fortune across an ocean, through decades, through the hands of a man who had known how to conceal and when to reveal. It had arrived in Emma's life at the moment she needed it most, disguised as a burden that everyone else dismissed. And it had transformed her, not instantly or completely, but steadily and irrevocably. From someone who struggled to survive into someone who had the resources to build. The wealth was significant, but the real inheritance had been the opportunity to discover what she was capable of when everything depended on her refusal to give up. Emma closed the book and tucked Lily into bed, the small rituals that marked the end of another day. She turned off the lights and stood for a moment in her daughter's doorway, watching her sleep in a room that was safe and comfortable and theirs. The journey from the eviction notice to this moment had been longer and harder than Emma could have imagined when she first discovered the hidden compartment. But she had traveled it successfully, claiming not just wealth, but agency, not just money, but the right to determine her own future. Her grandfather's final gift had not been the fortune hidden in the armoire. It had been the challenge to prove herself worthy of claiming it. And Emma had met that challenge, step by a difficult step, until the burden transformed into a blessing. The armoire would stay with her, a silent witness to everything that had changed and everything that remained. It was no longer just furniture. It was history, transformation, and vindication, all carved into dark wood that had survived longer than anyone expected. And standing in her own home, surrounded by the life she had built from hidden assets and stubborn determination, Emma understood that sometimes the things others dismiss as worthless are exactly what you need. You just have to be willing to see past appearances, to dig deeper than surface judgments suggest, to claim what's being offered even when everyone else walks away. The discovery had changed everything, but it had started with a simple decision to accept a burden no one else wanted. And that decision, made in a lawyer's office while her family watched with pity and dismissal, had been the first step toward a transformation she was still learning to understand. The armoire stood against the wall, its dark surface absorbing the soft light from the hallway. Inside its hidden compartment, nothing remained but empty space and the memory of what it had once held. But that was enough. The inheritance had been claimed, the wealth had been accessed, the transformation had taken root. Emma had become the person her grandfather had believed she could be, someone who would value what others overlooked, who would fight for what was given to her, who would persist when persistence was the only path forward. The journey was complete, and it had been worth every difficult step. The months following the final redemption brought a kind of peace Emma had never experienced, but it was peace complicated by questions she had not anticipated when she first discovered the hidden compartment. Wealth had solved the problems it could solve, the immediate, tangible crises that had defined her existence for so long. But it had also revealed other challenges, ones that came with having resources rather than lacking them. She found herself thinking about legacy, not in the abstract way people discuss inheritance and estate planning, but in the concrete sense of what she would build with what her grandfather had given her. The money sat in accounts, carefully diversified according to advice from the financial advisor Moss had recommended. It was safe, growing slowly through conservative investments. But safety felt insufficient somehow, passive when the inheritance itself had been so active, so transformative. Emma began researching foundations, scholarship programs, ways to convert wealth into opportunity for others who faced the kinds of barriers she had faced. She contacted organizations that supported single mothers, that provided emergency assistance for families on the edge of financial collapse. She donated anonymously at first, testing the process, learning how institutional giving worked. The first significant donation went to a program that helped low-income families with emergency expenses, medical bills, car repairs, the kinds of sudden costs that could destroy fragile stability. Emma contributed $50,000, enough to help dozens of families bridge gaps that might otherwise have led to evictions, job losses, cascading failures. The program director sent a thank you letter that Emma read 3 times, absorbing the specific stories of people whose lives had been stabilized by funds she had provided. It felt different from simply possessing wealth. It felt like participating in something larger than her own transformation, acknowledging that the inheritance had been both earned and fortunate, deserved and accidental. She had fought for it, yes, but she had also been in the right place at the right time, the recipient of a bequest that could easily have been divided differently or concealed permanently. She established a small scholarship fund at the community college where she was taking classes, designated for single parents pursuing education while supporting children. The amount was modest by institutional standards, enough to cover tuition and books for 2 students per semester. But Emma understood that modest amounts could be transformative when they arrived at the right moment. She had lived that truth. Now she could extend it to others. Patricia from the warehouse reached out unexpectedly one afternoon, her voice tentative on the phone. She had heard from mutual acquaintances that Emma's circumstances had improved substantially. She wanted to know if Emma might consider investing in a small business Patricia's daughter was trying to start, a bakery in a neighborhood that needed more local options. Emma met with them both, listened to the business plan, asked questions she was still learning how to ask. The bakery was a risk, the kind of venture that failed more often than it succeeded. But Patricia had been kind to her during the worst period of her struggle, offering advice without judgment, treating her with dignity when others had offered only pity. Emma invested $30,000, not as a loan, but as equity. She did not expect to recover the money, and she told Patricia as much. But the investment was not really about return. It was about acknowledging that kindness mattered, that the people who had treated her well when she had nothing deserved consideration when she had resources. The bakery opened 6 months later. Emma attended the opening, watching Patricia's daughter serve customers with nervous pride. Seeing the neighborhood residents who had been waiting for exactly this kind of business. It might fail, but for now, it existed, employing 4 people and providing something the community wanted. Lily asked questions about money now, questions that Emma tried to answer honestly without overwhelming her. Where did the money come from? How much was there? Would they always be comfortable? Emma explained about her great-grandfather, about the Armoire, about the discovery and the fight to claim it. She simplified the story, removing the complexity that a 9-year-old did not need to carry. "So we're rich now?" Lily asked. Emma considered the question carefully. "We have enough, more than enough, but that doesn't mean we stop being careful or grateful. Can I get a horse?" "No." Lily accepted this without argument, her pragmatism reasserting itself. She was a child of 2 realities now, the one she had lived before the inheritance and the one she inhabited after. Emma watched her navigate between them, sometimes asking for things that would have been impossible in the old apartment, sometimes demonstrating the caution that came from years of scarcity. The balance was delicate. Emma wanted Lily to benefit from what the inheritance provided, but she did not want her to become someone who expected wealth as a natural condition rather than recognizing it as circumstance. She enrolled Lily in a school where economic diversity was genuine, where children from different backgrounds learned together. It was not the most prestigious option, but it felt more honest than isolating her in an environment where everyone possessed similar advantages. Emma returned to work, though not at the warehouse. She accepted a position at a nonprofit that provided job training and placement services for people re-entering the workforce after incarceration or long unemployment. The salary was modest, less than she could earn elsewhere, but the work felt meaningful in ways her previous jobs had not. She helped people navigate systems that were designed to be opaque, offering the kind of practical support she wished she had received during her own struggles. Her colleagues did not know about the inheritance. They treated her as simply another person, committed to the organization's mission. Emma preferred it that way. Anonymity allowed her to participate without the complications that wealth introduced into relationships. She could offer suggestions without people wondering if she was planning to donate. She could connect with clients without the barrier of obvious economic disparity. One of those clients was a woman named Sandra, 43 years old, recently divorced, struggling to find employment after 15 years as a stay-at-home parent. Her story was different from Emma's in specifics, but identical in structure. The collapse of a marriage, the sudden need to support herself and children, the discovery that time away from the workforce had left her without marketable credentials. Sandra attended the job training program with determined focus, absorbing information about resume writing, interviewing skills, professional presentation. Emma worked with her individually, helping her identify transferable skills, practice answers to difficult questions, build confidence that had been eroded by years of financial dependence. During one session, Sandra mentioned that her landlord had raised her rent, and she was struggling to cover the increase while paying for childcare and transportation to the training program. Emma listened without offering immediate solutions. At the end of the session, she suggested Sandra apply for emergency assistance through one of the programs the nonprofit partnered with. She did not mention that she had funded that program. She simply made sure Sandra had the application and knew how to submit it. 2 weeks later, Sandra received a grant that covered 3 months of the rent increase, enough time for her to complete the training and secure employment. She cried when she told Emma about it, not knowing that Emma had been part of the chain that made the assistance possible. Emma accepted her gratitude without revealing her role, understanding that some help was most effective when given without recognition. The pattern repeated itself with other clients. Emma identified needs, then quietly ensured resources were available through institutional channels rather than personal intervention. It was slower and less direct than simply writing checks, but it felt more sustainable. Systems that functioned properly could help more people than individual generosity could reach. Claire visited the new apartment for the first time in late summer, bringing her children and a carefully wrapped gift. The visit was tentative, both sisters aware that rebuilding trust required small steps maintained over time, rather than grand gestures. They made lunch together while the children played in Lily's room, their conversation avoiding the sharpest topics, but acknowledging the reality that lay beneath surface pleasantries. "The apartment is beautiful," Claire said, and Emma heard the genuine admiration beneath words that could have carried resentment. "Thank you." "I was wrong," Claire said again, as she had at the cafe months earlier. "Not just about the legal claim, about how I treated you before any of that. I judged you for struggling, like it was a character flaw rather than circumstance." Emma set down the knife she had been using to slice vegetables. "I judged you too, for having stability, for not understanding what it was like to worry about rent every month." They looked at each other across the kitchen counter, years of accumulated misunderstanding visible between them. The inheritance had forced confrontation, but the healing required something else, a willingness to see each other beyond the roles they had occupied in the family narrative. "Can we start over?" Claire asked. "We can try." The visit extended into the evening, the children requesting a movie, the sisters agreeing without discussing whether it meant extending the tentative peace they were building. By the time Claire left, something had shifted, not repaired completely, but open to the possibility of repair. Their mother remained more distant, her pride making reconciliation slower. But she softened in small ways, remembering Lily's birthday, sending cards at holidays, accepting invitations she would have declined a year earlier. Emma did not push. She understood that some damage took longer to heal, that her mother's sense of how things should have been distributed was deeply rooted in principles that had shaped her entire life. The armoire remained in Emma's bedroom, its presence a constant reminder of the journey that had brought her here. She had thought about replacing it, buying modern furniture that matched the apartment's aesthetic. But each time she considered it, she stopped. The armoire had earned its place. It was not beautiful, but beauty was not its purpose. It was a witness, a keeper of secrets, a container that had held more than anyone suspected. She cleaned it carefully one weekend, polishing the dark wood, treating the brass handles, restoring what could be restored. Lily helped, asking questions about great-grandfather, wanting to know more about the man who had left them this strange inheritance. Emma shared what she knew, which was more than she had known 3 years earlier, but still incomplete. "Do you think he was a good person?" Lily asked. Emma paused, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think he was complicated. He did things that might not have been right to get what he needed. But he also protected it and passed it on to someone who needed it. Maybe that's as close to good as anyone gets." The answer seemed to satisfy Lily, who returned to polishing brass handles with focused attention. As autumn approached again, marking 4 years since her grandfather's death, Emma reflected on what the inheritance had meant beyond the obvious transformation of circumstances. It had taught her that value was often hidden, that the things dismissed by consensus might contain worth that only revealed itself to those willing to look carefully. It had shown her that fighting for what you believe you deserve was exhausting but necessary, that systems would not voluntarily grant you what you did not claim with persistence. It had also revealed the price of wealth, the way it complicated relationships, created suspicion, demanded decisions that had no clear right answers. She had gained financial security, but lost the simplicity of relationships that had existed when everyone shared similar struggles. She had acquired resources, but also the responsibility of deciding how to use them in ways that honored both her needs and the fortune of having received them. The total value of the inheritance, after all redemptions and conversions, had been precisely $2,743,000. After taxes and fees, Emma retained just under $2 million. It was enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life if she was careful. It was enough to ensure Lily's education and opportunities. It was enough to give away substantial amounts without diminishing her own security. But it was not infinite. Emma understood that wealth this scale required stewardship, thoughtful management, decisions made with awareness that resources could be depleted. She hired a financial planner, established trusts, created structures that would preserve what she had gained while allowing her to use it purposefully. She thought sometimes about what her grandfather would think of how she had used his gift, whether he would approve of her donations, her modest lifestyle despite having resources for more, her choice to work rather than simply live on the inheritance. The questions were unanswerable, but they guided her decisions nonetheless. A silent conversation with a man who had shaped her life without ever knowing the specifics of the circumstances he was shaping it for. The armoire stood witness to all of it, its dark wood absorbing the changing light as seasons passed and Emma's life continued to evolve. It was no longer a burden or a treasure. It was simply furniture that held memory, that marked transformation, that reminded her daily of where she had been and how far the journey had brought her. And standing in her bedroom late one night, unable to sleep, Emma understood with perfect clarity that the real inheritance had never been the money at all. It had been the discovery that she possessed the strength to claim what was being offered, to fight through complexity and doubt, to persist when easier paths suggested surrender. The wealth had changed her circumstances, but the journey to claim it had changed her, revealing capacities she had not known she possessed, teaching her that she was capable of far more than her previous struggles had suggested. That was the gift her grandfather had truly left her. Not bearer bonds or stock certificates or jewelry, but the opportunity to discover herself through the process of claiming them. He had hidden the treasure not to make it difficult, but to ensure that whoever found it would be someone willing to work for it. someone who understood that value required effort, and that transformation demanded more than luck. Emma had been that person. And in becoming her, she had received an inheritance that no amount of money could capture, the knowledge that she was stronger, more capable, and more resilient than she had ever imagined possible. The armoire held that knowledge now, sealed in its empty compartment, waiting for the day when someone else might discover what it meant to fight for something no one else believed you deserved. And Emma, standing before it in the quiet apartment, understood that she had honored her grandfather's gift, not by keeping the wealth, but by becoming worthy of having received it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.